Why am I standing here in the middle of a cemetery? After all, a lot of people, my wife included, thinks that cemeteries are creepy. Well, I don't. I love cemeteries. Why is that? Because they are genealogy gold. And really, the main reason I'm here is to announce that I am starting a new series of videos on cemetery and death-related records, because there's all kinds of great information for genealogy in there. So I hope you'll join me. But now, this first video is on cemeteries. So, hey, stick with me. I'll be back in my studio right after this. Thank you for joining me, fellow roadie. Your viewing and support means so much to me. It makes me so happy. So thanks again. Now, on to cemeteries. Over the years, TV and movies have consistently portrayed cemeteries as spooky and evil places. But don't fall for that, family history researchers. Cemeteries can be a fantastic resource for pursuing your ancestors. And I want to show you how to find that information. Now, this might be surprising, but the cemetery itself should be the last place you visit to find information that can be revealed by cemeteries. Now, why in the world would I say that? Because during the 30 years I've been finding my family history, I've spent lots and lots of time walking around cemeteries, often during hot summer days, trying to locate my ancestors. Now, most of the time, I did not find the ancestor I was searching for. And it was especially tough doing this because where most of my research takes place, in cemeteries in Pennsylvania, those cemeteries are very hilly, so there's lots of walking uphill. Now, I want you to avoid tromping around the cemetery for hours or even days with no success. So, where should you start? Okay, to start out, we'll assume that you do not even know what cemetery your ancestors are buried in. So how do you find that out? Well, the first thing you should do is check with your family. Now, look, if the person you're looking for is several generations back, odds aren't real good that your family's going to know where they're buried. But if they're a little closer, if it's your great-grandparents, then maybe your parents or grandparents might have some idea where they're buried. So check them out first. A second source you can go to is a death certificate. Now, we're going to talk a lot more about that in a future video, so stay tuned for that. But a death certificate, the vast majority of the time, will tell you where that person is going to be buried, and even sometimes the date. Okay, the next place you should check out, or source you should check out, is an obituary or death notice that you can find in newspapers. Now, again, we'll have a video devoted just to these. But just know that you can look for those obituaries in a lot of different places, but even just online. If you just put in the name of the ancestor you're looking for, and then the word obituary, you might find something. You just never know. But we'll talk about more sources for that in the video devoted just to that. What's the other source? Well, it's online cemetery databases. There are databases online that are devoted strictly to telling you who's in certain cemeteries. Now, there's 3 sites. The number one that I suggest is called Find a Grave. And you can see the URL for that on your screen right now. The second one is Billion Graves. And the third one is called interment.net. All you have to do is put in their name, and if you have more information, like where you think they're buried, whether it's a state, a county, a city, start broad, and then go down further until you find them, if they're in there. They're, obviously, not everyone's name is going to be in these databases. So take a look at those and see how successful those can be for you. Now we're going to move to if you know the cemetery where they are buried, but don't know where they are in that particular cemetery. Okay, first of all, once again, check with your family. They might know where they're buried, or they might have some paperwork which maybe shows where they're buried. Now, this may or may not work. There's a good chance that it may not work. So you can go on to the next source, which is once again the online cemetery databases. Now these databases will show normally, if the person is in the database, where they are buried, the cemetery that they're buried in. Maybe even a picture of the headstone. But sometimes it may have more information. It might even have information about who their parents are, who their spouse was, who their children were. And it may even have a specific location in the cemetery where they're buried, a section, a plot number, and so on. So even if it has just a section, which can be fairly large, that's going to be helpful because that might narrow it down to just, of course, a much smaller part of the cemetery. Another place you want to go to is the cemetery office. Now, commercial cemeteries will almost always have an office you can go to. Now, of course, they're only going to be open certain times of the day, and you might want to check online to see what those hours are. But commercial cemeteries can be very useful, their offices, in finding your ancestor in the cemetery. They'll usually tell you the exact plot where they are. And even more important, they can provide a map to show you exactly where in that cemetery they're located. Now, even if you find the information about what plot they're buried in, say from one of the online cemetery databases, you can still go to the office in the commercial cemetery and get a map from them and ask them where that plot would be located, and they'll help you out. They're usually the most helpful. Now, what about a municipal cemetery? That's one that's run by a city or county, maybe. Now, in that case, usually the best thing to do is to go to that city or county's website, and you can find information there about that cemetery. And you can see there how you get access to the records, or how you find out where your ancestor is buried in that cemetery. Now, I haven't come across any municipal cemeteries where they have an office on site where someone could answer that. But if you've ever come across one, let me know in the comments down below. Okay, and then you have church cemeteries. Now, once again, church cemeteries rarely have an office on site at the cemetery where you can ask where a particular person is buried. Once again, if you've come across any that do, in the comments down below, let me know. I'd like to know about it because I've never come across one myself. Now, church cemeteries can be more difficult to track down where people are in that cemetery. If the cemetery is small, like one ancestor I had that I thought was maybe buried in a particular church cemetery near where I grew up, this cemetery only had maybe, I'd say 100, maybe as much as 150 graves. So that's not too difficult to be able to just walk through. Now, this person I was walking through, I did not see a headstone for them. I mean, I wasn't even for sure knowing that that's where he was buried. I mean, that's a church where he was married and I assume attended while he was alive. But once again, I don't know that for sure. So I had to try to track down, because the church for that cemetery was no longer in existence. So I asked around a bit, and I found out that there was a man, not part of the church, not a church official, that actually had the cemetery records for that cemetery. Now, I sort of knew this man when, before I left that area, we were in the same organization together, so we knew each other. We knew each other by name and said hi, but, we weren't friends or anything. And he just happened to be, at one time, the mayor of the city I lived in. But I also knew where he lived because he lived very close to me. So maybe I shouldn't have done it, but I showed up at his house one day. I just knocked on his door. Says, "Hi, I'm Greg Kleist. Remember me from this organization we're in?" He says, "Oh, yeah, sure." He says, "I was told that you have the cemetery records for this church's cemetery." He says, "Yeah, I do." And he was very friendly. He invited me in. He got out the records that he had, and we both looked at them. And we did not see my ancestor's name anywhere in these records. But he did tell me, and I'm sure this is true for a lot of other churches. Now, this was a Catholic church. I can't speak for other churches, but he said that for this particular church, but like I said, I'm sure it applies to other churches too. He says some priests there were very diligent in keeping the records for the cemetery and burials there, and other things with the church, which is births and marriages, baptisms, and all that. It says some priests were, hit and miss on how they kept the records from time to time, year to year. And then some priests just really didn't care too much, didn't think it was so important to keep good records on these things. So he said it's possible that guy is buried there, but that I certainly can't prove it from the records that were currently available for that church. So it was very nice of him to be able for me to take a look through it and for him to take a look through them. Like I said, it wasn't a huge cemetery, so there wasn't a ton of records there, but unfortunately not for my relative. Now, what else can you do if a church no longer exists? You don't even know if the records exist anywhere. Well, there's a couple things to do. The first thing I would suggest, at least for a Catholic church, is to go to the diocese that church is in. The Catholic Church, the diocese is the next level up from the church. A diocese has a group of churches underneath of it in a particular region. In this case, it was the Diocese of Pittsburgh. So I actually didn't go to the diocese first. I just went into Google and put in the name of that cemetery. Now, this was a different relative, by the way, because I knew where the records for that other cemetery was. So I have another ancestor in another cemetery, which was even further back than my great-grandfather. I just typed in the name of the cemetery, and it came up online, and looking through all this, I found out that the records for this church and several others were actually kept by an organization under the Diocese of Pittsburgh. It was an organization specifically for keeping records of cemeteries for churches that were no longer active. So I found the name of that organization, looked it up online, and it had details for how to request information about burial records for my ancestor in that cemetery. Of course, you had to send in a check for, I forget what it was, I think maybe $15. So I sent that in. Unfortunately, I had no luck there. So sometimes you're going to have luck with it, sometimes you're not. So like I said, church cemetery records can be a challenge. Sometimes you can be very successful, sometimes not. Hopefully more successful with an active church. The next type of cemetery where you can try to find records from is a family cemetery. Now, this is going to be even tougher than the church cemeteries, because most of the time, these family cemeteries are going to be on private property. Now, not all the time. Now, the ideal situation is that this family cemetery is still in your family, that ancestors sold it to someone in their family, and it's still in the family. That way, hopefully, you can go to the family member who owns that and say, hey, can I take a look at the cemetery? The not so good thing that could happen is it could have been sold at some point to someone outside of the family, not related to you in any way whatsoever. Now, you can go and ask them if you can take a look at the cemetery, but they may have no interest in letting you do that. And in some cases, since it's not their family members in that old cemetery, they may not have even kept that cemetery up. It might have become overgrown and impossible to really get to. And even in a worst case scenario, they might have pulled up the headstones and just used the land for something else. Now, that's kind of gross, and it might even be illegal depending on when they might have done that. But that's one of the hazards of trying to find ancestors in a family cemetery that's not in your family anymore. Now, I had an interesting experience with a family cemetery. I was doing some research in a local county historical and genealogical society, and I found my ancestor in a cemetery. They had a cemetery book there that had the names of people buried in different cemeteries in the county. And this one was it had the surname and then family cemetery. Say, for example, Smith. It just said Smith Family Cemetery. And I got directions to it from this very knowledgeable person at the local historical and genealogical society. And that's a wonderful resource, by the way, for a lot of stuff. So I went to this cemetery. It took me a little while to find it because you could not see it from the road. So, and there wasn't really GPS there when I was looking for it. So I went to where I thought it was. I pulled off the road. Okay, there was a place that mined stone almost right next to this cemetery. And then there was a fairly small wooded area, I'd say maybe an acre or two. And I could see there was almost like a little path that went into this wooded area. So I says, well, okay, I'm gonna try going in there. I had no idea if that was the right place, but I walked in there, and then I came out to a clearing with headstones there. There were maybe, probably about 15, at the most 20 headstones there. And someone had apparently been keeping up this little cemetery. The grass was cut. There were no weeds, but all around it was this wooded area. Now, if no one had been keeping this place nice and neat and cut, this place would have certainly been overgrown, and no one might have even known it still existed. So, and I'll show you some pictures right now up on the screen. These are some of the headstones of my ancestors that were in this little family cemetery. Now, I don't know who owned this land that was here. Maybe it was the stone quarry that was right next to the cemetery. I don't know. There were no fences keeping people out of it. There were no signs saying this was posted or you could not come in this area. Nothing like that. So maybe that was a little lucky there. So you never know what you're going to find, even with a so-called family cemetery that I could get to easily. Like I said, it was not fenced off, there was no sign, so I still to this day don't even know what the status of that little cemetery is. But hey, now we haven't talked about what to do when you actually go into the cemetery itself. Now that's going to be the next video I post, so be sure to tune into that because it's going to be interesting. It's always fun going into a cemetery, but I have some tips for you that I think will be very useful. So until next time, I'll see you on the road to your family history.